So, who's really in charge of nonprofit organizations? Is it the paid staff? Is it the volunteers? Is it the board of directors? Let's discuss the role that board of directors play in nonprofit organizations and how they provide governance. In this lesson, we're moving on to part 3, which discusses volunteers as one of those key stakeholder groups of nonprofit organizations. Specifically, we're going to address board of directors and the governance of nonprofit agencies. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the governance of nonprofits and the role that the board of directors plays. You'll understand their core responsibilities, be able to distinguish between the two primary types of nonprofit boards, governance and advisory. You'll understand common types of advisory boards, board leadership positions, how decisions are made in nonprofit boards, and ways that we can hold board of directors accountable with performance management. First, let's talk about nonprofit governance and understand the role that the board plays in that governance. Nonprofit governance simply refers to that system, the policies, the practices, the processes that guide the direction and management and decision making within that agency. This includes good governance, where everyone works together as a team. Nonprofits are complex organizations. There are a lot of key stakeholder groups. There are a lot of people who have that vested interest in the organization. And you have to make sure everyone is working together to ensure that the organizational mission is carried out, both ethically and effectively. And unfortunately, for many nonprofit agencies, governance tends to be underdeveloped. Now, from a legal standpoint, nonprofit organizations are required to have a board of directors. But whether or not that's a good and effective and ethical board of directors is a whole other question. So let's talk about the role of the board. Many for-profit companies have boards too, depending on how they're classified, and nonprofits have boards as well. We talked about in a previous lesson the difference between for-profit and nonprofit boards. But as a friendly reminder, nonprofit boards are non-paid volunteer positions. This is a group of individuals who are either elected or appointed to provide that oversight. They're in charge of that overall strategic direction. They're heavily involved in the things like a strategic plan, which we talked about previously, but remember, half of nonprofits don't have one. And they're there to guide the activities of an organization, ensuring that the agency is behaving ethically and it's operating in accordance with the mission and any relevant laws. Now, something that's commonly misunderstood about nonprofits is that the role of the board can vary depending on the board type. And in nonprofits, there are two types of boards. There are governing boards and there are advisory boards. The structure of a nonprofit and the type of board or boards that it has is typically defined in its bylaws. So the bylaws are a written set of rules and regulations that outline things like the internal structure, governance, board positions, board elections, operations of the organization, who's on the board and how decisions are made, and a lot of other key management and leadership factors. So if you work for a nonprofit agency or you're doing an agency analysis, it's really important to get your hands on those bylaws because that's kind of like the US Constitution for that nonprofit. It's a really important document that explains really the central foundation of that organization. Now, as I mentioned, some of the things that are included in the bylaws relate specifically to the board of directors. And one of those things that includes is the composition and responsibilities of the board. Board members serve in a fiduciary role, and that's a fancy term that basically means that they have a legal or ethical relationship of trust. So one party, the fiduciary, in this case, the board member, they have a fiduciary role. They're obligated to act in the best interest of the organization, the other party, the nonprofit agency where they're on the board. And even if that means putting that nonprofit agency's needs and interests ahead of their own, that's what they're supposed to do as a fiduciary. Now, compared to the for-profit sector and their board of directors, nonprofit boards generally get more involved in the organization's operations, and that can be a good thing. Boards are usually people that are very well established and successful professionally. They have a lot of skills and talents that they can contribute. But the downside is that this can lead to some tensions sometimes around the perception of the board being overly involved, the board overstepping the boundaries of what the board does versus what the staff should do, of micromanagement, of blurring the lines between volunteer and staff member. So if you're in a nonprofit agency, it's really important to have a volunteer staff partnership. We'll talk about this at length later, but that partnership is critical because you have to strike that balance between the role and responsibilities of the paid staff compared to the role and responsibilities of the unpaid volunteers. And that goes for the board as well. And those need to be working in partnership, not in competition with one another. Now let's talk about the legal responsibilities and obligations of a nonprofit board. A nonprofit board has three primary legal duties: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And the legal obligations of boards, this can vary by country, but what you see here with the duty of care, loyalty, and obedience is representative of boards in the United States. Duty of care means that they're caring for the agency's resources. They're ensuring that all of the facilities, the personnel, the reputation, the use of those resources, financial and otherwise, are being used responsibly. That's the take care of part. So, duty of care. Just like a parent takes care of a child, a board member needs to care for their nonprofit agency in the same maternal or paternal type of way. Duty of loyalty, this ensures that they're being loyal to the organization. As I mentioned, board members have a responsibility to put the organization's interests ahead of their own. So when they accept a board position, they're accepting that they're going to comply with the duty of loyalty. They're going to be ride or die. They're all in. They're in it to win it, even if it means personal sacrifice to the gain of the nonprofit agency. And that always, first and foremost, they're focusing on advancing the mission. And then finally, duty of obedience. If someone accepts a board role in a nonprofit agency, they agree to be obedient. And by that, I mean they're willing to follow the laws, regulations, and rules of the bylaws of the organization and stay committed to the mission, the vision, and the values. And if you're ever asked to serve on a nonprofit board, again, it's important, especially to look at those bylaws and to understand these things and only say yes to a board position if you're willing to take on these responsibilities. Many would argue that those legal obligations are the bare minimum of what a nonprofit board member should do. Many nonprofits are only as successful as their board of directors. And the most successful nonprofits have really strong board of directors that don't just do the basic legal requirements, but they also follow these additional obligations as well. And this includes an obligation to lead, an obligation to fund, and an obligation to advocate. An obligation to lead means that a board member is willing to do the work. Yes, these are unpaid positions. These are volunteer roles, but it's a very important responsibility that's put upon someone who is appointed or elected to a nonprofit board position. So it's their responsibility to make sure they are putting in the work. They're doing the effort to lead the organization toward its mission achievement and strategic objectives. And it's also their responsibility to oversee that executive director or CEO position. They also have an obligation to fund. And what you'll find in real life is that many nonprofit board members generally tend to be a little bit on the wealthier side. These are often major donors, but if you do accept a board role for a nonprofit organization, it's kind of a give or get thing. If you don't have the means personally to provide financial donations and support to the organization, you can still fulfill your obligation to fund by being willing to go out and fundraise from other people on behalf of the organization. So you're not directly contributing financially, but you're serving as the factor that's driving other funding to the agency. And it also means being willing to engage in fundraising activities. And then finally, obligation to advocate. This means not just political advocacy, which we'll spend a whole lesson talking about. And this is where you're lobbying for legislation that is in benefit or the interest of the organization, but it also means being a vocal, passionate, loyal, and positive ambassador out in the community. That if you have a problem with the nonprofit where you're on the board, you're not bad mouthing them in the community, you're not being shady on social media, that you're always being positive and you're putting a good face on the organization because you also represent that organization, and that it's okay to have a problem or have a disagreement with the leadership or the staff of the organization, but you need to be an adult and responsible and have those conversations privately and resolve those issues in-house and not take it out to the streets. Now let's talk about the two primary types of nonprofit boards. Nonprofits can have one of two types of boards. There's either a governing board or an advisory board. A governing board, that's the one that has that governance responsibility, that legal fiduciary responsibility we just talked about, and overall responsibility for governance and strategic direction. They make the high-level decisions, they set policies, and they ensure the organization is fulfilling its mission. Sometimes nonprofits have a governing board and advisory boards, and in affiliate organizations, many times affiliates, chapters, and branches will have an advisory board. An advisory board isn't there to provide governance. They're there to provide input. They're giving their expertise, they're giving their guidance, they're making recommendations, but they do not have that formal decision-making authority. Now, every nonprofit is required by law to have one governing board. So every nonprofit is going to have one governing board. But some nonprofits choose to have a governing board, but they'll also have advisory boards that help out with certain things like programs, events, or even certain tasks like fundraising. They'll do this through volunteer subcommittees, but these are advisory board positions. Now, remember in a previous lesson, we talked at length about affiliate organizations. This is where you have a large umbrella organization that has dozens or even hundreds of branches, chapters, or affiliate offices across the world or across the United States. For those affiliate organizations, they want to have local board involvement, but they can't have a governing board. There's only one governing board, and that is the umbrella organization. But at the local level, the affiliates, chapters, and branches often will have an advisory board that advises on local matters of concern for local issues for that local chapter, branch, or affiliate. But the only governing board is held at that national or international level. So let's talk a little bit about the distinctions between governing versus advisory boards. Governing boards are elected, advisory boards are not. Rather, they're appointed. Usually you'll have a nonprofit agency that has interested or qualified volunteers that either volunteer and raise their hand and come to the surface that way, or they'll go out into the community and recruit, or they'll identify an existing volunteer that maybe would be good, elevating beyond just basic volunteer tasks to be in an advisory capacity. And remember, all nonprofits are required to have a governing board. There's only one governing board, and it is that governing board that has the job of hiring and overseeing the nonprofit's CEO or executive director, that head position. Advisory boards, they do not have any staff oversight. They do not have any supervisory relationship with staff at all. Now, the role of advisory boards, again, is to give advice, to advise. That's why they're called advisory boards. But they're also expected to do a lot of the things that we talked about are the obligations of board members, which are to be advocates and ambassadors for the cause, to advance the mission, to behave ethically like a fiduciary, to donate and support the organization. So just because it's a non-governing advisory board position, you should have obligations and expectations too. Now, remember in a previous lesson, we talked at length about organizational structure and design. So if you were to look at the organizational chart of a nonprofit, you'll see that the reporting line looks something like this. You've got a board of directors overseeing the executive director. So they're responsible for hiring, supervising, measuring performance, sometimes firing, and doing all of the supervision for the CEO or executive director position. And then the executive director has the responsibility for overseeing the subordinate staff positions in that organization. So when it comes to staff supervision, even a governing board usually only oversees and supervises that executive director leadership position, and all the other staff management is left up to that ED. Now that you know the roles, responsibilities, and obligations of a governing board, and you know the difference between a governance board and an advisory board, let's talk about some common types and ways that nonprofits can use advisory boards and leverage them to fulfill the mission. Now, remember, the only type of board that has governance and decision-making authority is the governing board. If a nonprofit has an advisory board or several advisory boards, they lack the authority to make decisions. They're there to provide advice and guidance, but that's still a very important function. Here are some of the ways that nonprofits use advisory boards. They can use them to fundraise. They can use them to cultivate young professionals who are potentially going to eventually be on the governing board. They can use them for programs and events, or they can have geographic advisory boards. Fundraising advisory boards are obviously involved in development work. They assist the nonprofit in fundraising, either by directly being involved with fundraising and serving kind of like their fundraising officers and going out into the community and raising money directly on behalf of the nonprofit, or they're helping nonprofit staff inform and decide on their fundraising strategy and doing things like donor stewardship, donor meetings, donor thank you calls. Young professional advisory boards are a great way to nurture incoming board members. A lot of nonprofits have a common problem, which is that their boards of directors tend to be much older. And there's a lot of value to that. There's a lot of advice and expertise that seasoned professionals can offer to an agency. But that often comes at the detriment of sometimes not being on the cusp of innovation. And the board tends to then age out, and there's not a good succession plan. So to address this, a lot of nonprofit agencies have established young professional advisory boards. That is to bring in young professionals in a board-like position giving them opportunities to provide advice, labor, expertise, kind of in a sort of board member role. But this is really kind of meant to nurture them, to give them experience in the position, but also provide value to the organization. And if they do a great job in that role, a lot of times this can be a feeder system into the actual governing board. So if you yourself are a young professional and you find nonprofit work interesting and you're into leadership and management, not just volunteerism, it might be worthwhile to check out and explore and search for YP opportunities in your local community, because this is a really great way to network. It's a really great resume booster. Most importantly, it's a really great way to give back to the community. Program and event advisory boards, they're advisory, but they exist to manage specific programs and events and services. And they also will often provide that volunteer labor when staff resources are limited. So when I was executive director for a nonprofit agency, we had large fundraising events. So I would have a 5K walk every single year. I had a program advisory board in charge of that event, and they worked in partnership with us as paid staff to make decisions about the logistics, the fundraising strategy, marketing and communications, and everything about executing the event. And then on event day, they were our lead volunteers. They had helped recruit other volunteers. And on event day, they would manage and lead other volunteers. And it really allowed us as a small staff team to do big things because we could amplify our efforts. And then regional or chapter advisory boards. As I mentioned previously, nonprofits that operate on that affiliate model, they have one governing board at that national or international level. And all the chapters, branches, and affiliates, they generally have their own chapter, branch, or affiliate advisory boards. So this allows the local community to feel like they're involved in their local chapter, branch, or affiliate, but they don't have that governance responsibility or authority. Now, short of complying with IRS regulations and basic laws, nonprofits have a lot of autonomy when it comes to how and who and when and where they use advisory boards. But ultimately, the primary objective of all advisory boards is to support the nonprofit and its mission. So nonprofit leaders need to decide, where does an advisory board make sense? Where do we need a higher level of volunteer labor and input and advice and feedback, and implement advisory boards accordingly? Now, sometimes nonprofit agencies, to avoid confusion with their governing board, prefer to use a committee terminology instead of advisory board. And I can tell you from personal experience, I worked for an affiliate organization. I was executive director of a local chapter. I had an advisory board, and I did have to repeatedly remind them that they were an advisory board, not a governance board, that our governance board was held at that international level, not at our local level, and that they didn't supervise me, they didn't have decision-making authority and all of that. So it's really important that when you have a volunteer serving in a board or a committee or key leadership role, that they do understand their roles, responsibilities, and level of authority. So in a lot of agencies, when they have advisory groups or advisory boards, they choose to use the committee terminology instead of calling it a board. And again, that's to avoid that confusion with the actual governing board. Now, when it comes to board positions, regardless of the type of board, it's really important that you don't have the same old people all the time, year after year after year after year after year. So a lot of agencies will choose to establish term limits. And sometimes the committees or advisory boards themselves are not permanent. An advisory board or a committee, we're using those terms interchangeably, they can be either standing, meaning they're there for the long term, or they can be ad hoc, which is temporary. So a standing advisory committee, these are usually going to be for your ongoing major activities that last longer than a year. So usually nonprofits, if they have a YP board or a YP committee, that will be in existence basically forever. Now, the people on that committee or on that board, they'll rotate, they'll have term limits. New people will come on, existing people will roll off, but it's a standing advisory board. If you have a big fundraising event year after year, as I mentioned, my 5K fundraising walk, I had a standing walk committee. That never changed. Now, sometimes in nonprofits, though, you have a need for a short-term or temporary purpose. You might need an ad hoc advisory board. So, for example, if you're getting ready to engage in a capital campaign to fund a bigger, newer facility to house your agency, you might want to establish a temporary ad hoc advisory board of people that can come together and help in that process of raising the money, doing a site selection, and making all the decisions needed to get the organization moved to its new home. Now let's talk about board leadership positions and how they interact with staff. as well as how board members are selected. Nonprofit agencies that have a lot of volunteers, that they have a lot of committees, they need some leadership. So for agencies that have an advisory board or several advisory boards or several committees, they will opt to establish a leadership hierarchy of authority within that volunteer group. And usually the person that leads this group is defined as a volunteer chair. It's still a volunteer position, it's still not paid, but that chair title and position is giving that volunteer leadership and decision-making authority over the group and over the other volunteers in that group. So if you were to put together an organizational chart for your volunteer committees or groups, which I think all nonprofits should, it might look something like this, where you have your advisory board chair or your committee chair at the top. They may even have a vice chair, and then they might have volunteer leaders over specific segments for whatever purpose that group serves. So if it's a big volunteer group, you actually might need to have a taller hierarchy of authority. You might need different layers and levels of leadership in there. But all of that is going to depend on the size of the group and the needs that it serves. And when you look at that hierarchy of authority, there is a dashed line horizontal relationship between the advisory board chair or committee chair. Again, we use these terms interchangeably, and the staff member who's responsible for that particular event or program. So that means the staff member doesn't necessarily supervise the event chair, but that also doesn't mean the event chair necessarily has all of the authority, but rather it's that volunteer staff collaboration and partnership. So that dotted line relationship, that's really important. A central component of nonprofit success is the power of that volunteer staff relationship. And we will talk about that a lot. And that's what that dotted line relationship means, is that they are working in partnership. No one is necessarily the authority over the other. And it's really important that both that volunteer chair and the staff member working with that volunteer chair understand that dotted line staff volunteer partnership. So the way that a nonprofit chooses to establish advisory boards or committees, the way they decide to establish a hierarchy of authority and put volunteers in key leadership roles within these committees is completely up to them as well. So there is a lot of autonomy and freedom when it comes to how nonprofits approach advisory boards or advisory committees. And again, that's the same thing. Now, governing boards, on the other hand, there isn't as much freedom with this. Remember, nonprofits are required to have a governing board. There's just one governing board. How that governing board is structured and led is established and determined by that organizational bylaws. In the bylaws, that will usually dictate the leadership of that governance board. Now, in most cases, most nonprofits choose to have an executive committee. This is where not everyone's just on the governance board, but there are certain leadership positions among the board members. They have distinct responsibility, a higher level of authority compared to a general board member position. Now, legally, nonprofits are required to not just have a board, but that board needs to have at least 3 members at a bare minimum. Most nonprofit agencies have many more than 3, but that is the bare minimum per legal requirements. Most nonprofit agencies, at a bare minimum, choose to have 4 because there are 4 critical executive committee positions needed to effectively run a governing board. That includes the president role, the vice president, the treasurer, and the secretary. Nonprofit governing board positions are elected positions. Advisory boards or advisory committees, those are appointed, but governing board positions are elected. And once that board is elected, governing board leadership is also elected to lead that board of general members. A nonprofit board president is the individual board member who's been elected to preside over the overarching board of directors. Their responsibility is to provide that top level decision making, strategic leadership. They're there to guide board discussions, make sure the board is productive and efficient. And they're also expected to represent the organization to outside stakeholders. Now, a really good nonprofit board president will do a lot of other things as well. They'll play a key role in high level fundraising. They'll help recruit other board members and make sure that there's a good succession plan and do a lot of other really important high level tasks as well. A nonprofit vice president is that second in command. They're the deputy to the board president. They might assume those presidential responsibilities if the president is absent, or they may lead specific initiatives or committees. And in most cases, this position is established as a succession plan. So when the board president's term is over, that vice president has experience and knowledge, and then they seamlessly roll into that president position if elected. A treasurer is the board member responsible for all the financial matters. They manage financial records, audits, budgets, financial reports. They report on the financial health and performance of the agency at board meetings, and their role is to ensure the organization is financially healthy and that they're being accountable with all financial metrics. The secretary is the board member responsible for maintaining accurate records. And this isn't just taking some casual notes, but nonprofit bylaws usually have pretty strict recording requirements for board meeting minutes. They help ensure compliance with legal requirements. They handle communication on board matters. They might coordinate and ensure that board meetings are scheduled and are executed as planned. And they assist in maintaining documentation like the bylaws. Every nonprofit is required to have a governing board, and there's just one governing board, and those board positions are elected, and the bare minimum is 3 members. So having a board as per legal requirements, that's pretty easy, but having a good board, that's a whole other challenge. So it's really important that nonprofit agencies make a real effort when it comes to board development. The board president is working in partnership with that executive director or CEO on board development. And this is a process of systematically enhancing the composition, meaning the people who are on the board, the effectiveness of the board, and the overall performance of the organization and its board of directors. This is such important work that some leaders choose to formalize a written board development plan. It's like a mini strategic plan, but specific to board development, about how we're going to go out and recruit board members. They help train and onboard new board members once they're elected and retain those board members once they're in those positions. Because governing board positions are elected positions, they must go through a nominating process. This is a formal organized procedure, and it's going to be set forth in the bylaws. And this dictates how the organization identifies, evaluates, and selects and elects suitable candidates for the board. Usually this follows a pretty straightforward process. There's nominations. People can self-nominate or someone else can nominate, say, hey, I think this person would be a great member of this nonprofit board. Then there needs to be a vetting process. This can be done by volunteers, board members, staff, where you're actually reviewing the skills, qualifications, connection, and interest in the mission of that potential candidate. Then any candidate has to go up for vote from the existing board. And the existing board has to approve and vote to elect new members. And strong nonprofits with really strong and effective boards don't stop just there. They also implement a formal orientation process. You don't just want to throw a board member who has some important responsibilities and obligations into the position. Maybe they've never served on a board before, or maybe their board experience hasn't been the best. You need to make sure you're setting forth the expectations and they have the skills, the knowledge, and the tools necessary to be effective in that job. Now, it's really important that you don't have the same old people year after year being involved in boards. That goes for the non-governing and advisory boards, but it also goes for the governing boards as well. And in fact, governing boards have required term limits that will be defined in the bylaws. This says that there's a predetermined maximum length of time that individuals can serve on the board. This is meant to ensure fresh voices, fresh perspectives, to promote diversity, and to prevent stagnation. Now, term limits, that's more of a best practice. It's not a legal requirement, but you'll be hard-pressed to find a board that doesn't have some type of term limit provision written into their bylaws. Now, the challenging thing about term limits is sometimes you have an absolute rock star board member. They're amazing. They're willing to be a board member for 10, 20 years. Why would you kick them off due to term limits if they're so amazing? So yeah, that's a problem that can sometimes happen. But oftentimes board members will sit out a term and then they can go back for re-election after they've sat out at least a year. Now, while term limits are important, another downfall of them is that you constantly need to be focused on succession planning. As these board members rotate off the board, sometimes it's voluntarily. People just get burned out. They've done their service. They don't want to do it anymore. Or they hit their term limit and they can't serve on the board anymore, or at least until they sit out a year. But succession planning is always in the forefront of nonprofits, of making sure that we have really qualified people ready to come in to replace these people that are terming off the board. And that requires constant work. And one way to approach this is through a strategic process called succession planning. Sometimes this might be built into a strategic plan. Sometimes it might be separate from the strategic plan. But you always want to make sure you have a list of people who are ready, qualified, and able to come into the board when positions become vacant. And quick side note, while the legal requirement for nonprofit boards is to have one governing board of at least 3 members, most nonprofits choose to have larger boards. There is no set number of how many board members any nonprofit should have. And I've seen some, I'm not kidding, that have as many as 100 board members, which I think is really excessive and kind of defeats the purpose of having a core group of people leading an organization. But by and large, I would say most nonprofit agencies have boards that tend to be on the smaller side. So those people can really play that governance role and be effective leaders. And that could be anywhere from 10 to 19 people, but there is absolutely no set number unless it's something that the organization has built into its bylaws. Succession planning is really important. And the process of identifying people ready to go onto the board is what we call building a board pipeline. So you've got this constant steady stream of folks who are serving on the board, ready to rotate off. You've got people kind of at bat, so to speak, ready to come onto the board. You even have your YP or young professional advisory groups, grooming them to come into the board pipeline. And this is an ongoing process. Now let's talk about how nonprofit boards make decisions. Nonprofits are required to hold regular meetings of their governing board. This is so they can carry out their fiduciary responsibilities. The role of the board secretary is important because they're also required to keep and distribute meeting minutes. And that is usually the job of the board secretary. In the United States, the IRS and many states expect nonprofit boards to meet at least once a year, although that's the bare minimum. Most meet much more frequently than that. I've seen some boards that meet monthly, some that meet quarterly, and some really involved boards of really small nonprofits that even meet more frequently than monthly. When making decisions, many nonprofits follow something that's called Robert's Rules of Order. And this is just a framework that allows groups to have majority rule while still allowing minority voices to be heard. So if you're in a board meeting, a board is presented with a decision that it has to make and vote on. You'll see a typical procedure that looks something like this. A motion will be brought forth by a board member. That's the presentation. And then discussion will occur. That's debate. So every board member has an opportunity to have their voice heard. Then that motion will be called to vote. So a board member in the meeting will say, I move to vote on this particular motion. Another board member has to second that motion of, I second that motion to vote on this topic, and then voting will occur. It's the president's responsibility to tally the votes and announce results, and it's the responsibility of the board secretary to record the results of the votes and the names of those who are involved. And they document that in the meeting minutes. And then if that motion is passed, then it is implemented and executed. Now, not every decision in a nonprofit goes before the board. That would be completely ineffective and very grossly inefficient. So usually decisions that are put forth to the board for official vote, these are going to be really major decisions. Some nonprofit bylaws require what's called a quorum. This refers to the minimum number of eligible board members who are required to be present at the meeting for the meeting to be valid. So if you have a board of 30 people and you have a board meeting that's in person, there's a big snowstorm, 2 people show up, 2 people are not allowed to vote on a motion or a decision. You have to have a quorum, and the bylaws will determine how many people that needs to be. Now, many nonprofits, they'll allow passage of a vote based on democracy or majority vote. That means that more than half of the votes that are cast by the persons legally entitled to vote have voted affirmative for that. Now, an interesting dynamic of nonprofit boards is that sometimes nonprofit executive directors will serve on their own boards, especially chapters, branches, and affiliates, but this is a non-voting member. So nonprofit executive directors and CEOs, they have a presence at board meeting. Sometimes they're actually the predominant presence, but anything that comes to vote, they are not allowed to vote on. And for certain topics or sensitive matters related to that leader, him or herself, sometimes they'll be asked to leave the room while the board has a discussion and vote, and then they'll be asked to return after the vote has been concluded and recorded. Now that we've talked about different types of nonprofit boards and the role that they play, let's talk about how we hold board members accountable. Effective boards need to be engaged. This means that the board members need to be active participants. They need to be committed. They need to be following their duties and their obligations. They need to be contributing their skills. They need to be raising money or donating money. And it's the responsibility of the executive director and board president to make sure that they have active and engaged boards, that they're measuring board effectiveness and engagement, and that as good leaders, they're intervening when a gap exists between expectations and actual performance. Now, measuring performance of nonprofit leadership is important. But how nonprofits go about doing this, it's going to vary widely from agency to agency. Some nonprofits do an amazing job of keeping their boards active and engaged. Others, not so much. And if you talk to a lot of folks who run nonprofits, you'll find that board engagement is a common pain point. So here are some ways to evaluate performance of board members. Because yeah, they're volunteers, they're leaders, they're not paid staff. But we still need to hold them to account. One is a BSA, which is a board self-assessment. This is a questionnaire that you send to individual board members to gather their own self-assessments, their own input and feedback about how they feel they've been doing as a board member. Personally, as an executive director, I loved the BSA because oftentimes if I had a very underperforming, unengaged board member, by sending them the BSA and by specifically asking questions that they had to answer no to, in the course of doing the assessment, they would realize I've been slacking. And as a result of that, they would either resign from the board, realizing they just didn't have the time to give to it that they thought they would, or they would step up and start being more engaged. And I didn't have to have any awkward conversations with them at all. Another assessment is a P2P or a peer-to-peer assessment. This is where you're asking board members to evaluate their own performance as well as performance of their fellow board members. So this is kind of a peer assessment that aims to understand the overall performance and culture of the entire board and how it's influenced by individual members within it. Another common approach is a board scorecard. This is a document that a nonprofit will put together that highlights these important factors that they need to achieve to fulfill their mission. It might be amount of dollars raised, it might be amount of meetings held with future donors, it might be hours volunteered, annual giving expectations, meeting attendance, participation in various events, things like that. And they'll put together the scorecard and measure each board member's performance across all of those metrics. So this is a way to apply those KPIs that we talked about previously to board positions to hold them accountable. But it's important for leaders, being the executive director and or board president, to not just measure performance of board members, but act on any issues that arise. So if you do a board scorecard and a board member scores very poorly, that you don't just stick your head in the sand and practice decision avoidance, but instead that you have a conversation with that board member about their lack of participation. So as you can see, board of directors serve a critical role in every nonprofit agency. Whether they're a governing position or an advisory position, these are volunteers who play a key role in the success of the organization and its fulfillment of mission.